Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. I promise you there's tea, coffee outside, and this discussion, more than anything else, I think should wake up a lot of people in the room as well, in case you're feeling a bit drowsy. The point of doing a conversation, hosting a conversation around the Rohingya crisis in a conference like this, I think is fairly self-explanatory. We are talking about communities at risk of being radicalized. And in that conversation, certainly from the Indian perspective, the Rohingya is one such community. The refugee crisis that the region is seeing has spawned a conversation about how hosting them is proving to be or could be a security risk for some of the host countries. So I think with that, to preface this conversation, we are going to talk about how we can look at a community at risk, look at the challenges that are around their return to their own home countries, how neighboring states can host them, what the balance needs to be between their human rights and protection and serious challenges of security with countries. Let me first start with Zarni, who is also from Myanmar and brings a unique perspective to this conversation. Zarni, we've seen that, I mean, over nearly 1.2 million Rohingya, I think, have been displaced since 2012 from Myanmar. Most of them live as refugees in Bangladesh. India hosts a number of them as well. But the conversation around what is to happen with this population, whether it's in India, whether it's in Bangladesh, or other neighboring regions, is centered around making sure they go back to Myanmar, because no country really wants them. They are nobody's people in a sense today. For a community which is nobody's, what is the threat or what is the fear of radicalization and taking up arms by this community?
Yeah. Well, two things. Has anyone in this room who has been in security field for your grown-up lives has ever heard of a Rohingya story where a man or a woman radicalized and blew him or herself up? Has anyone here heard of a Rohingya organization that has said that they want to have an Islamic state or caliphate in the Bay of Bengal? Of course, the answer empirically is no. So I want to say something here about where I come from. I am Buddhist. My family served in the armed forces since day one for the last 3 generations. I was a military academy admit at the age of 16. My father threatened to disown me if I joined the armed forces, and so I ended up being a civilian. And secondly, I bring a perspective that is grounded in the analysis, the framework of understanding totalitarian systems and ideologies. And my advisor was a U.S. military interpreter and intelligence officer who interrogated mid-ranking SS officers. And he was a specialist on SS. He called this kind of thing, the kind of thing that we as Burma, as a state, has done to the Rohingya, social engineering. And this is a social engineering project undertaken by the state of Myanmar as early as 1966. The project started peacefully because the military felt that the single largest Muslim population of the 16 or so different pockets of Muslims across the country, being adjacent to the then East Pakistan in 1966, would pose a security threat, would pose a threat to Buddhist way of life. And so they attempted to do what Suharto did in Indonesia in the 60s, transmigration. They wanted to entice the Buddhists to come and settle in the Bay of Bengal area, the ancestrally Rohingya area. And so when peaceful attempts to demographically re-engineer this region next to Bangladesh in 66 and onward in the next 10 years. When peaceful attempts failed, General Ne Win put in high gear and started the first violent campaign in 1978. So this is the campaign, the project directed by the state itself over the last 40 years. In those 40 years, there is not a single incident of Rohingya blowing him or herself up, not a single organization that claims that they want a separate state. All they are claiming, even the ASA, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, a small impoverished group of like poorly armed, desperate, angry Rohingyas operating across Bangladesh and Burmese borders. This is the only terrorist group, terrorist within quotation marks, that say we believe in Universal Declaration of Rights, that say we want to be a part of Burma as full and equal citizens, and that says UN should come and investigate what Amnesty accused us of having done that, which is to kill other co-religionists. So I'll stop as an opening remark.
All right, let me just bring Kanchan in on this before we move on to Yhome and Meenakshi. Kanchan, Gupta, do you think that the points that Zarni has raised about when we talk about radicalization of this community, we're looking at it from a different perspective? Perhaps it cannot be applied to the Rohingya community, which is at the receiving end of violence and marginalization by their own state. Do you think that the presence of this armed faction, in a sense, has become an excuse for countries to say that they are a potential security risk? I mean, we hear that in India as well quite often when it comes to the issue of hosting Rohingya refugees in India or to send them back to Myanmar. This conversation comes up quite a bit, but look at how they are being violent, look at how they are being radicalized. I mean, you know, is that an excuse really?
I don't think the last round of violence which led to the massive exodus of Rohingya from Myanmar should be seen as the potential trigger point for radicalization. It has been well documented that the nature of Islam which the community as a whole would subscribe to is not a very tolerant version. And there is enough literature on that, but I don't want to go into that zone. We have the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, and their agenda, their charter of demands, does include a separate state or a separate place or a separate zone for the Rohingya exclusively. So again, the point that they have never made such a demand doesn't arise. The conflict between the Buddhist clergy and the Rohingya community leadership is also, I mean, you could say it's a chicken and egg story. One doesn't know which came first, but there was a certain amount of violence, anti-Buddhist violence, which was involved in the leading to the backlash, which again then snowballed into what could loosely be called premeditated state violence. So there is radicalization happening. Will this fact that so many of them were pushed out increase the risk of radicalization? Of course, it will. Does that legitimize counter-violence? No, it doesn't. I mean, you have to premise every solution to a crisis of this nature that the state must be democratic, the processes must be democratic, and in that situation, no counter-violence can be legitimized. To say that they are justified in hitting back at the state is not justified. And the last point which I would like to make, we often discuss the enormous nature of the grief caused to Rohingya Muslims. There is a minority group within the Rohingya who are not Muslims and they are Hindus. The amnesty investigation showed the brutality. Now, I am not quoting, I have no independent access to facts. But if amnesty is to be trusted on its other reports, then this report should also be taken seriously. That the brutality which was visited upon the Hindu minority faction or group within the Rohingya community is unthinkable. And nobody really knows why it happened, because at that point of time, the Rohingya themselves were under attack. So it is not a black and white situation. And we will come to the other part as to what happens now or what are the possible solutions. But as an opening comment, I would like to suggest that let us not treat anybody as saints and the others as sinners. So that is not how the world works in real life.
Meenakshi Ganguly, let me bring you in on this because, from your perspective, heading Human Rights Watch in the region, the conversations over the exodus of the Rohingya from Myanmar have played into this larger global Islamophobia. Now, I take Kanchan's point on and head on. Amnesty's report was something that was alarming. It made the news in India, certainly. But that's one microcosm of a larger problem as well. So are we getting trapped in looking at small crises within the crisis instead of looking for a holistic solution overall? And essentially, how do we work towards a rehabilitation process? Because it's quite clear, even when you hear the UN Secretary General talk about the Rohingya, nobody really wants to take this on today.
No, you're absolutely right. No one does. In human rights, we are often talking about the cycle of violence. One is used to sort of justify another kind of, it becomes a cycle of violence. We see it in Kashmir, we see it in various parts of the world. Earlier in the discussion we were talking about technology, and I think the Facebook representative talked about how they want to stop. They are very cautious about proscribed groups and how they must be very careful about not promoting those messages. What is actually important is the narrative of persecution that majority communities also adopt. Now, what happened in the Rohingya crisis was that there was a majoritarian view on the Rohingya. And yes, it culminated actually 2 years in this month, August 25th, on the last round of violence. But the first lot of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, UNHCR registered Rohingya refugees, 34,000 of them came in 1990. So this has been going on. And to a large part, it is not based on, yes, some of it was religion, but some of it is ethnic. And to a Burmese state, which is ethnically, the Rohingya just don't belong. So when the Home Minister of Bangladesh went to meet with Aung San Suu Kyi, in the room full, he told me the story, and he said, the military representative over there looked at me and said, look at you and look at the Rohingya. They are Bengali Muslims like you. They belong in Bangladesh. So we have to understand, and this is something Indians don't often get, that for the Burmese people, for the majority Burmese people, the Rohingya belong to the Indian subcontinent. They look like us. They're called Kalas in Burma. They are called Bengalis in Burma. So, and if we don't understand that part of it, and that is not something that is only Burma, Myanmar is guilty of, we are becoming an increasingly bigoted people around the world. So, and Indian will get beaten up in the US, or Brexit will happen, and God knows who's going to get beaten up there. So we are becoming a bigoted people, and in that bigotry, narrative, in that narrative of the othering, the Rohingya are not welcome. Now, what are we going to do about it? The Bangladeshis will argue that if that was the case, then if you think that 1 million Rohingya belong in Bangladesh, there are 1 million Buddhists who are in that same border on the Bangladesh side. We have never said you should take them back, because that is the nature of new borders. People have gotten mixed up, and now you have these guys. So how are we going to change it? To a large part, in any refugee situation, we talk about safe, voluntary, dignified return. The Rohingya today are not arguing that they don't want to go back. They are saying we want to go back, but it has to be safe and dignified. We should get citizenship rights. We shouldn't have to go through this strange NVC process, this verification process. We don't want our biometrics to be the only Myanmar nationals who have to have biometric data stocked up, because then you're going to track us and accuse us of all sorts of things. None, those are things that will have to be worked out. Unfortunately, the only person who's taking any role in this, and where India has been significantly missing because they are so sort of obsessed with the fact that these are Muslims, 40,000 Muslims have turned up in the Indian border. They're not looking beyond that at the Rohingya crisis as a refugee crisis. Sadly, because India in the past has played these very significant roles on refugee crisis. But in this particular case, India is missing in action, so it's been left to China. Now, what is China going to be doing? What standards is China going to be setting in problem solving something like this? So they block any UN Security Council action, and they want to sort of sit and clunk two heads together, the Myanmar and the Bangladeshi heads of state, and solve this problem. And that's not going to solve the problem.
Right. In fact, on that question, Yhome, since your research is about how China is responding to this situation, shed some light on that and also address concerns about how China is managing its own ethnic crises within the country. The Xinjiang model, is it something that the global community supports today?
Yeah, I think to understand the Chinese response, or the way the Chinese are approaching this, I think that 2 or 3 key objectives, strategic objectives that the Chinese have. One is, I think let's go back to the 2011, 2012. That was the time when you saw Myanmar opening up, the Western powers, US and others coming in. And that was a time when the relationship between Myanmar and China was entering into a very difficult phase. Now, there were 3 key strategic objectives that Chinese were interested in Myanmar, as far as the ethnic conflicts and the Rohingya was concerned. One is it wanted to play a key role in the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. The idea is they wanted to control the pace of the peace process that was emerging in Myanmar, and the other is to minimize the role of other external players, including the UN and even the US. The second objective of the Chinese was to use their role in the ethnic conflicts and move closer or build goodwill with the Myanmar government, given the fact that the Burmese government was trying to move closer to the US, and in a sense to also arrest that process. And I think the third element of that, of the Chinese interest, was to, by building relationship with the Myanmar government, they could then push their strategic infrastructure projects as part of the BRI in that country. So I think within that geopolitical context, and the fact that the Rohingya issue, the crisis emerged within that context, I think the Chinese response was to use that to align their position with the Myanmar government, to support the Myanmar government in the international community, in the UNSC, and also to play a leading role so that they could gain some of the lost ground that they perceive that they have. After the changes in the political situation in Myanmar. So I think it was against this backdrop that we saw China coming in a big way and trying to play a mediatory role between Myanmar and Bangladesh. Certainly the Burmese was not liking the idea that the Chinese would mediate this. And they stood their foot and said, we don't want the Chinese mediation here. We have also seen the Chinese trying to mediate in some of the other ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. I think one of the key, let's say, observation that one could see here is that while the Chinese want to take a leadership role in the regional crisis conflict, the Burmese are also playing that balancing game. And within that context, I think despite the kind of proposals that the Chinese have come up with, the three-step proposals that the Chinese have come up in resolving the Rohingya problem, one has not seen that process moving it forward. And I think the Chinese engagement, though they have taken an active role, a proactive role in the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar, including on the Rohingya issue, we have not seen the Chinese able to push anything forward in as far as the resolution of the conflict is concerned.
Kanchan, come in on this also. I mean, just before you respond to this, I want to ask a question and you can address both of them together. You know, Meenakshi also made the point about how China blocks resolutions at the United Nations when it comes to dealing with the Rohingya crisis. From India, the perspective now is one that has changed. India has been a refugee-friendly country in spite of not having been a signatory to the convention right since independence. What has changed in India in terms of the narrative and the context over here? And the third is, how do you see this going forward? What kind of a negotiated settlement do you think could be possible in the region when it comes to this community?
Just before I come to this,
Sure.
a couple of responses. You know, Meenakshi is right when she says that you cannot disown the fact that there is an element of ethnicity or ethnic supremacy, sense of ethnic supremacy at play over here. But that again is not something new. Let us not forget that Burma throughout, before it became Myanmar, Burma threw out a large number of Indians, most of them Bengalis, some Tamils. Burma has since conducted their own NRC. They have done extensive profiling, they have done biometrics, and now you have, I understand, I was in Rangoon recently, and what I could understand is that you get 3 different categories of cards to be resident over there. So that system is in place, and it is not going to change because the world wishes it to change. Bangladesh itself has not been exactly charitable towards Buddhists. We know what happened to the Buddhists of Chittagong Hills, how they were persecuted, and most of them actually, in fact, are now in India. These are the givens. Now, how do you go about changing it? India's own experience has been very uneven with giving shelter to refugees. We have sheltered the Tibetans, the entire palace, and others who came with the palace, and subsequently their tribe has increased over here, and they have lived peacefully, they have lived in harmony. We don't ever hear about Tibetan refugees creating problems. They have amalgamated with society at large. In fact, many of them, the young Tibetans now don't want to be referred to as Tibetans. The other experience which India has had is 1971, when we had close to 10 million refugees pouring in. And in 1971, India was it was a dirt poor country. We couldn't even feed our own. And yet we took them in. And after the liberation war was over, after Bangladesh was formed, only maybe about a third or slightly more of them went back. The others did not go back, although the conditions that existed at that point of time for them to go back were perfect. Now, what do we do with Rohingya? There is a crisis. You cannot dispute that. It is unfair to expect that Bangladesh should shoulder the crisis all on its own. I understand some amount of aid has been coming in, but that can't really be sufficient. So a process has to be set in motion, a process where Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India. Now, why I'm saying India? Because India can leverage its relationship with Myanmar to bring about to broker some sort of an agreement which ensures at the first stage that the Rohingya who return shall be safe, that there will be no immediate retaliation. In the short term, in the medium term, their safety is guaranteed and underwritten by the Myanmar state. It should be a verifiable process. It can be done in parts, like you don't send back everybody at the same time. Now, towards that end, again, India did play an undeclared role in it. And I understand that this point did figure in Prime Minister Modi's discussions with the Myanmar leadership. And it was agreed that India will not sort of make a public statement of it. Subsequently, there were discussions between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and they came up with an agreement which was verifiable, which could be monitored, that a first batch of refugees will go back. Their names, their identities, their addresses will be documented, and it will be monitored. Meenakshi would know the full details of this process. Yet, when it came to actual repatriation, none of the Rohingya who were on the list were willing to go back. And they just disappeared. I mean, they disappeared into the labyrinthine refugee camps over there. And the process had to be abandoned. Now, it is very legitimate for them to say that we don't trust a state that has persecuted us, that has killed us, that has murdered us. But this distrust has to end at some point of time. The permanency of refugees is no longer acceptable to any country anywhere in the world. Europe did open up its doors to hordes of people who came in seeking political asylum, seeking refugee status. And today, Europe is torn asunder over this whole thing as to how to deal with it. There is no agreement on it. Countries have now put in place blanket ban on foreigners entering their borders. Getting a visa to any European country has not been so difficult. I mean, I can't imagine.
This is the borderless world we live in.
Yeah, but you see, I had to stand in a queue. Unthinkable. It was an affront, I thought, because earlier you could just toss in your passport into the embassy or the High Commission or whatever, and it would come back. No, it doesn't happen that way anymore. So the world has changed. The realities have changed. And increasingly, now, the mention was made of China. China is cynical about it. They will do anything. And everything that they do will be bereft of any compunction, of any moral dimension, because for them, everything that they do is in furtherance of their power game. So we need not bother about that. Again, now this point about China and its own attitude towards ethnic supremacy. The Han Chinese have occupied Tibet. If you go to Lhasa today, you don't see Tibetan signs anymore. You don't see the Tibetan script anymore. All signage is in a language which is alien to the people who still remain in Tibet. So this whole thing has to be handled minus China. India can and should play a role behind the scenes. Bangladesh has to proactively engage with Myanmar, and other countries have to facilitate that and underwrite that process. After all, if Indonesia doesn't want them, Malaysia doesn't want them, Thailand doesn't want them. Now, if you don't want them, you have to stop them. Now, how do you stop them? You stop them by getting Myanmar to agree to some sort of a concord that will allow the Rohingya to return, carry on with their way of life without disturbing the peace and without the Buddhist majority disturbing their lives.
I think, Kanchan, what you're basically talking about is a regional sort of
It has to be
effort that can interact with Myanmar on this, because it is fundamentally a regional problem. Zarni,
without any observers. You see, no country likes foreigners to come in and observe.
Yeah.
Zarni, just come in on this.
I think because, we are all with good intentions exploring potential solutions to end the Rohingya humanitarian crisis. But I think we can only find viable solutions if we diagnose the issue accurately. We have a cancer-like situation in its most advanced stage, genocide. If there are any groups in the world that understand the full force of the word genocide, it is the Jews and the Germans. And I've heard with my own ears, German Foreign Office Human Rights Program Director in Berlin, in a public forum describing Myanmar's situation as genocide, coming from German. I specialize in genocide studies. Also in the United States, a coalition of Jewish organizations. I mean, forget the United Nations report. If genocide survivors and the Holocaust Museum unequivocally come out and say Rohingyas are Jews of Burma. Yeah. So if this is indeed a case of a textbook genocide, this is not a conflict between Buddhists and Muslims or Buddhist Rakhines and Rohingya Muslims who share this land over centuries. Yeah, if you've been to Rakhine State or on this side of the borders, geomorphologically, there is a continuity. Commercially, culturally, linguistically, these are borderland people, nothing exceptional. Like when nation states boundaries were drawn, I mean, Indians should know this, but, with the stroke of a pen, you've got major conflicts. And secondly, you cannot have a negotiated settlement between a black and white, institutions of persecution and destruction, the state in Burma, not just the military. The military, however powerful it is, it's only one component of the Burmese state. And this is something that happens within the space where the state and Buddhist society interface. This is very much like Germany in 1930s. And thirdly, I lived in Burma as a Burmese from a military family for 25 years before I left the country for US for studies. I had never, ever heard of the word Rohingya. Not simply because they did not belong in that part of the country called Arakan Coastline or Rakhine State, but because General Ne Win's dictatorship was so effective that they airbrushed the Rohingya out of official discourses. And so when media and researchers say, oh, like the Burmese, the Buddhists absolutely hate Rohingyas. When I first heard the word Rohingya, in the, say, 1990s, I had absolutely no psychological or emotional reaction, neither good nor bad. If you don't know that these people exist, you cannot either hate or love them. If you don't know beef doesn't exist, you cannot crave or you cannot hate it. Yeah. So this is the case where hatred is manufactured. So like earlier, the panel is enemy at the gates. Yeah. And, this is precisely how the Burmese military has framed the Rohingya, enemies at the western gates. We border with 5 different countries. Yunnan province of China, southern China, Bangladesh, northeast India, Laos, and Thailand, and then the Bay of Bengal. Neither the military nor the Burmese society use the metaphor gate towards any parts of the border. Yeah? We have a situation where close to 100,000 Han Chinese were instantly given ethnicity status. They are called Mongyong Burmese because they were used by the Burmese military as a proxy against the nationalist Shan resistance movements. So this happened while at the same time the Burmese state erased the Rohingya, the word as well as the existence. So my own great uncle who passed away 2 years ago was the deputy commander in charge of Rakhine State. Yeah? And that's the peripheral regions, so-called, all the ethnic nationalities live today, since independence. They have never been under civilian government's control because every single ethnic nationality has risen up against the state since independence. While the Union Jack was coming down in Rangoon on January 4, 1948, the Burmese army was fighting 2 front wars in Arakan or Rakhine State. One was the Buddhist Rakhine, whose kingdoms was ransacked in 1785 by the Burmese, us, from the dry zone. And the other group was Mujahideens. They were at times collaborating together. So we've got the internal dynamic. Rakhine State, having been a colony of Burma 10 years after the French Revolution, is kept still as a colony. So there are 2 major groups, Buddhist Rakhines and Rohingya Muslims and others, who cohabited this land for centuries. We have to ensure that they must never get along, because then they will be a unified enemy against a colonial Burmese state. And my final point, this is not simply about the Rohingya. This is about the nature of the post-colonial state. Yeah? If you read like Burmese Days by George Orwell, he described the British civilizing mission and British Empire as just basically a system of murder, theft, and racist exploitation. This is like, Oxford-trained administrator, ICS, all of you know, Indian Civil Service members, yeah? They were sitting with Bankawala behind, in his words, 1 million bayonets to control Indian subcontinent. We were part of India, yeah? And Orwell described it. This is humbug, civilizing mission humbug. What we have today is state-building mission humbug, yeah? So we inherited this colonial state as brown people, yeah? The dominant people. Just as the colonial British state was racist and exploitative and murderous. Anyone who opposed the British the domination were described as dacoits. You all know this, yeah? And the same thing. And so I think the seeds of conflict were within this nature of the colonial state. That is why you see so 2 populations, and I will shut up, yeah? One was the Rohingya that have been framed and attacked preemptively as a threat to our culture and society, as well as to a military threat, because we felt that 160 million people, Bangladesh, might use Rohingya as a proxy to snatch that part of the country to ease the population burden.
Yeah.
So they are targeted for destruction. Whereas, in fact, the other minorities that are Mongoloids and look like me, we could be assimilated, providing that we, as minority, I'm not minority, I belong to the majority. Yeah, the minorities accept the political subjugation, but they are acceptable. Whereas, in fact, Rohingyas are not acceptable. That's why they are framed as Bengali. Even the word Bengali, the reference to Rohingya, is a creation within the last 10 years.
All right, okay, that was a very powerful intervention by you, Zarni. Meenakshi, I'd like you to come in a little bit on what both of them have said, especially to Kanchan's point about a negotiated settlement and people not wanting to go back, even if conditions are created for them to go back. There will be a resistance. As somebody who works on human rights, how do you respond to that? Because safety is your primary concern of these individuals as well. And to Zarni's intervention, the idea that ultimately this has a historical context. When you don't know of a population that exists, you can neither hate them nor love them. You don't know that they exist. And so are we invisibilizing, or are we trying to invisibilize this population?
Well, I think in the subcontinent, because of the number of ethnicities that exist, everyone is a minority. Today, when I'm talking about Kashmir on Twitter, I have Baloch groups shouting at me saying, why are you not talking about me? So, so yes, the Rohingya is an issue. In terms of them going back, and I think, first of all, because we're talking about CE, we should talk about what's happening to them. Now, there's 1 million people crowded into the settlement. It's the world's largest, and it is an unbelievable. Those of you who haven't seen it, it's indescribable.
You're talking about Cox's Bazar.
Yeah, Cox's Bazar. It is unbelievable. It is bamboo and plastic, and it's a sea. This used to be low-lying hills. It's covered in this tarpaulin, and these are people crowded in the most. And I live in Bombay, so I'm used to slums. Even I get shocked, of course, also by the scale of it. They have to go. We have to find a solution for this. And if we don't find a solution for this, this is where Bangladesh is also being very cautious, because they don't want the Rohingya to ever imagine that they have a permanent option in Bangladesh. So they will not even allow us to build cyclone shelters. Now, this is a region, Bangladesh being what it is, there's flooding, there are no permanent structures where you can keep them. So every time there's a landslide, 15 huts slide down the hill, and 2 people die.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt? Because in the last 40 years, there have been 2 major waves of Rohingyas that have returned. 250,000 in 1978, and another 250,000 in 1991, 92, 93, 94, in case that border on forced repatriation.
Okay.
It's not that Rohingyas do not know what it means to return. It's not that they know that
repatriation is not the answer.
Bangladesh is not a land of milk and honey.
Right.
There was no pull factor from Bangladesh.
Right.
They're there. It
Because
would
of
be
safety,
like
safety.
telling the survivors of Auschwitz, okay, there are new bathrooms and then new paints, and go back while SS is in power.
Okay. Meenakshi, you want to finish your point?
Yeah, so I'll just finish my
Meenakshi,
point.
I'll just take half
Can
a
she just
second.
finish her
Half a
point and I'll
second.
come
Just
back
half
to
a second. This whole thing about people don't want to go back because, or people, the conditions in which they live are not so that excellent that they shouldn't want to go back. That's not how real life works. Recently, a 4-year-old Indian girl was found dead at the US-Mexican border. Now, which Indian, which Indian in this country is so badly off that he or she would want to leave this country and try to sneak into America, even if it means that your children die on the way?
Yeah, Kanchan, I think you're talking about economic migrants, and that's a whole different chapter. But to continue what I was talking about, and I agree, there's a whole different challenge there. The Rohingya are not economic migrants. The Rohingya are
But
refugees.
they turn into
Yes,
economic
but
migrants.
they are refugees right now. They are refugees who have suffered, as Zarni said, some of the worst atrocities that we have witnessed in recent history. It is indescribable the kind of atrocities that were visited upon them. Now what are we going to do with these people? If Bangladesh will not let Rohingya kids go to school, they are in learning centers. They've already missed 2 years of schooling. If they were to go back, the child who's in class 6 will have to go back in class 6 because they can't go back to class 8. Since there is no education, there is a lot of children that are going into madrasas. So to the point that we set out to discuss, are we creating a situation where we are forcing a bunch of people who have suffered enormously
To radicalize.
As I said, atrocities that other people even will claim to be theirs. You know, when they want to describe their own persecution, they will actually, because they've just recently read about the Rohingyas, they will say it. Rapes and burning of little children, these stories that other communities now want to repeat, which fortunately has not happened to them, but they've heard has happened to the Rohingya, they adopt. But those things have happened to these people. They are deeply disturbed, they have lost their homes, and they are unwelcome in Bangladesh, and what are they going to do? So, in this situation, are we not creating a condition where if they become forgotten people, they have no choice? Now, all the questions about ARSA, yes, ARSA was a group that had 5 sticks and maybe 10 guns. But what did they do? And what happens when violent extremism, where does it come from? When does a persecuted community, which all of us claim, me as a Bengali in Bangladesh is forever feeling, in Bombay is forever feeling persecuted, a Gujarati is and a Malayali is, because all of us are minorities somewhere. So in that context, when does it turn into violence? It turns to violence when there are bunches of people, and this is happening now in the camps, where they come in and say, no one else is going to solve your problem. We have to come up with we have to force a solution. The only way the world is going to pay attention to us is if there is a bomb. So you're right, there has never been a Rohingya bomber. But are there people not telling them that if you do not set off a bomb, the world is not going to care? Yes, they are telling them this. And therefore, we do have to find a right-suspecting solution. That I think is the only way that we sort of say is an advance warning sort of situation where we try and find solutions.
Okay, I know that this has been a really animated conversation. We have about 10 minutes left in the session for questions and answers, and I'm sure that, well, we've already got many hands up. Can I request you all to just keep to one question, pointed question for the person you want on the panel, because that will allow us to get more people in. As we will finish this conversation in 10 minutes. So we have one hand over there. Yeah, right there.
Thank you, Maya. I have one fact check and one question to the organizers, and then one observation. Number one is, as Mr. Kanchan mentioned, that back in 1971, after the 1971 war, 2/3 of the Bangladeshi refugees who fled to India did not come back. I think it is a very kind of factual error statement. Not only more than 2/3 of those refugees returned to Bangladesh, but they are happily living in Bangladesh, and the other ones who were living in the refugee camps, they also came back. Number two is there is no Buddhist persecution is happening in Bangladesh. Back in 80s, when there were kind of separatist movement started by a couple of those ethnic minorities, we had seen some kind of challenges, and the state mechanism and the other neighbors actually helped us to quell those activities. Number three is, since Bangladesh is kind of the major party in any Rohingya-related conversation, I would request the organizers to have someone in the panel from Bangladesh so that they can express their opinions.
We were supposed to actually have someone from the Bangladeshi High Commission. They'll be speaking, the High Commissioner will speak in the evening because he had meetings in the day.
Thank you so much.
That's a clarification for you.
And the final point is, with regards to the local population, those who are actually helping the Rohingya refugees to live in Cox's Bazar, it looks like there are more than 1.2 million Rohingya refugees who are living in Cox's Bazar. Vis-a-vis, there are close to half a million Cox's Bazar people living in the area. The challenge is now these people are feeling threatened because of the existence of those Rohingya refugees. And how can we address the isolation that these people are feeling, because they are seeing that these people are not going to return to their homeland?
Right.
And how do you want to address their challenges?
Okay, all right, that's one question.
Thank
How
you.
do you address the challenges? We have one lady in the back and then all the way in the back. One
Yes,
hand
I want to focus a little more on the Rohingyas who are in India. Till 2012, India had extended long-term visas to them. In fact, the policy was quite accommodative. Then there was a very sharp volte-face. You suddenly got the terrorist discourse with which the Rohingyas were in which the Rohingyas were seen as a national security threat, something that was never substantiated and continues to, in fact, be an issue of controversy. However, that has not stopped the pushback of the Rohingyas at a time when the UN, as well as UNHCR and other agencies, have made clear that the situation is not conducive to return. We've been talking about return. Everybody's been talking about the possibility of return. What kind of return? To be stateless in Myanmar, to have no rights, to have no
Okay.
rights to survive or dignity?
Got the question. One question there at all the way in the back, the hand in the back. Yeah, right there. And then we'll just answer these and then I'll come to you. And I think we'll have to keep the answers brief as well, so we can get one more round of questions.
Yeah, the question was specifically addressed to Professor, and that was about saying that the violence of the Rohingyas, when it did happen, and the measure to which it did happen, is an interesting one, because when you had apartheid in South Africa, and they tried dialogue, and they tried working things out with them, and they didn't, and finally you had the ANC, which took to violence. In India, when we were fighting for our independence, Bhagat Singh, some people called him a terrorist, and we call him a freedom fighter. So until what extent, to what extent is a community expected to be subjugated and to keep on absorbing discrimination which is piled upon them? And at some point, the worm does turn.
All right.
And I think that's the question I would like to ask. If you're saying that at no point is their violence justified, what are they expected to do?
Okay. Shall we
May
just
I-
take these
some-
two,
some
three
quick-
questions and then, yeah, quick
half
responses.
second responses. One, I would like to clarify, I meant, never have I suggested that Bangladesh is to blame for the crisis or whatever. So, number two, I stand by what I said. 2/3 of the refugees who came in 1971 did not go back. In fact, the inflow has continued since then. It's a different problem. We shall deal with it separately. A last point. This whole thing about legitimizing violence. You cannot, if you are against violence by the state, you must be also against violence by individuals or organized groups, because violence cannot be the negotiating point in a democracy. You mentioned Bhagat Singh and others. They were not fighting a democratic state. They were not fighting their own state. They were fighting a colonial state. I mean, they were fighting the British, who had no business to be here. So the two situations do not compare. Myanmar, the Burmese are the people of Myanmar. If you want to be there, you have to negotiate a deal with them. A deal which does not demean you, a deal which does not diminish your rights, but at the same time which ensures that you will not do what your terrorist group has been doing in Burma. You will not go and kill Hindus like you did, and the amnesty report, I would ask all of you, just go on the net and read the report. You can't do something like that and say, oh, I am the victim.
Meenakshi, do you want to quickly comment on this as well? I'm
Sure.
just take quick responses from all of you.
Okay, I'll do it quickly. Host communities are absolutely agreed, and it's one of the things that we are promoting a lot, that the host community has to be addressed. Bangladesh, in fact, Kanchan, you will be interested to know, when the Rohingya first started coming in, kept saying they remember 1971 and how India behaved, and that is why they initially began to welcome the Rohingya. But now it's been 2 years, it's a big challenge for them. Rohingya in India, I cannot tell you how disappointed I am in India. I cannot, it is, as an Indian, I find it appalling that we have sent people back, violating refugee laws, saying that these people were in detention when they were in detention, and the only way that they have liberty is to be sent back to a place where they have been burned to death, where their homes have been burnt, where there are dead children. I cannot believe that the narrative that has been constructed by the state has been one where there are 40,000 potential terrorists who are Rohingya that have come in. It is a terrible and outrageous thing that has been done. In terms of the state values question, yes, you're right. I mean, when do people choose violent options? Unfortunately, never. That's the whole point, that they should not. But equally, it is the state's responsibility to not throw national security as this big rock at us every time there is any form of dissent, any form of protest, any way to peacefully claim for rights. Rohingya, as Zarni has repeatedly said, have never, yes, they committed that was one group of people. It was an outrageous act on the Hindu groups, but there were also
But they have
a huge
also
amount.
carried out attacks on army posts. They have carried out.
Yes, but look at what,
those things have
yes,
happened.
I'm saying cycle of
Accept the
violence.
reality.
Yeah.
Can I
So-
come in here? As we speak today, the Arakan army, it's made up of Buddhists, have attacked army posts, killed some of the informers from within the Rakhine Buddhist communities, yeah? And in ways that are far more effective. Then they attacked naval ship. They, just killed the 2IC, the second in command of a division. Yeah? Not a single security expert outside Burma has framed this Arakan army, primarily Buddhist, as jihadis or a threat to regional security. There is a very, very strong element of Islamophobia at work. If a Muslim community subject to a policy, nothing less than total destruction of the entire group, attempt to do something. I don't legitimize violence. We are in the land of Mahatma Gandhi. I was just at the museum yesterday. But what I'm saying is, even within Auschwitz, in October 1944, about several months before the Soviet Red Army stopped all that atrocity, Jewish inmates, with the help of Polish social workers that came in, blew up one of the gas chambers. They killed 5 SS officers who managed the gas chamber. And in retaliation, SS killed about 500 inmates. Yeah? So what I'm saying is, when you have extreme oppression, you are giving the target population absolutely no choice to radicalize. That's why Mandela said, means of resistance is determined by the oppressor. Yeah? Keep that in mind. So when you have a state that is determined as an act of policy to wipe your community out from your very physical, spiritual, cultural, intellectual foundation, economic means of sustenance, this community will turn radicalized. So then what we are seeing now is that Rohingyas are being subjected to what I call double preemption. The preemptive genocide undertaken by the Burmese military over the last 40 years, and the security community around the world projecting Rohingya what they might do if their situation doesn't change. And then finally, in the Cox's Bazar camp, there are 300,000 young men and women. That's out of 1.2 million population. They have absolutely nothing to do. Bangladesh does not want to allow them to study, to even have textbooks, because Bangladesh think that will become a pull factor. Yeah? Whereas in fact, it is not the pull factor that pulls 1.2 million. It is the push factor called genocide that drives the Rohingyas out of the country 5th time.
All right. Yhome, do you want to just comment on this very quickly? I'll
I
take
think,
one last question from there then.
Taking from Kanchan's about the regional approach, it's not that we have not tried this regional approach. India, ASEAN, for instance. Somehow, at the regional level also, we have not been able to push anything through as far as the Rohingya issue is concerned. But as an immediate term, perhaps, there's something that at the regional level, ASEAN, India, and particularly countries like Thailand and Indonesia can work together and try something in the Rohingya case. But I think also in the medium long term, I think we need to also bring in the issue of, or rather the conversation on the alternative voices within Myanmar also. So we need to recognize that there are voices there, dissenting voices against the extremist group ideology. So I think somehow, how do the international community, the regional countries can engage and strengthen these voices within the...
Which need to be strengthened.
Then develop...
In order to put pressure on the Myanmar government. All right.
Exactly.
That's an important point. We have one question over here, this hand right here. So one moment.
Thank you for the last opportunity, in fact. I have this open question. My name is Anurag. I'm from Vivekananda International Foundation. In the situation where since 2017, 700,000 more than it's been, Rohingyas has been, I would say, thrown out from their own land. And in a situation where Bangladesh has denied the basic right of education for the children, they have no opportunity or chance just to turn themselves to the madrasas or the religious institutions. And at the time when Hifazat-e Islam, which has a history of a madrasa which has a history of violent protest in Bangladesh, would there be I'll be wrong if I say that there is a great opportunity of getting them as a radicalized in that event, and also what the panel would suggest to the policy makers of the nation if they are in a situation where the nations are looking for transforming themselves into the smart cities, and themselves they are lacking on the resources. So how they would accommodate, the Rohingya population or any migrants into their own land in the lack of resources.
Okay,
Thanks.
got it. And Mr. Tripathi, we'll take the last question just from you. Yeah. Can you just getting you a mic?
Under the International Convention, generally such problems are dealt with in 3 ways. The most preferred way is for them to go back voluntarily to their country of origin. The second one is their settlement in the country of refuge. And third is the third country settlement. Here in this case, they are not welcome in Myanmar. Bangladesh doesn't want to keep them. Then why not look for a third country settlement for these persons? West, of course, is now not prepared to accept them, but there are more than 50 Islamic countries. What are they doing for them? Rather than putting pressure on others, why don't they accept them and resettle them in their own countries? These persons will also feel it more comfortable going to those countries and settle down.
Okay, all right. We'll just get you to respond. There was a question earlier about the local population of Cox's Bazar as well, and how there are tensions between the Rohingya who are in camps there and the strain on local resources. And that sort of ties in with what Anurag has also asked about, Bangladesh's course of development. How can it accommodate financially all these people, and yet achieve its goals? That's one. And then Kanchan, I think you can come in on the India question as well. So
yeah, I just want to say that, look, technically, India is under no obligation to take in any refugee from any country. We have not signed international agreements, covenants. So there is no obligation on our part. Yet, every time there has been a humanitarian crisis, India has responded accordingly, except this time. Why? As I said, that we have an experience, we have a background to it, so we don't want to get into that zone. Number two, I still believe that the best way to deal with it is for the regional countries to come to some sort of a agreement with Myanmar, that Myanmar shall take them back, and the countries that are in the negotiating process, they will underwrite the peace or the peaceful return through effective monitoring. If that can be done, it is doable. We know the problem, we know the background to the problem. Exaggerating the problem and calling it a genocide, calling it akin to what happened in Auschwitz, it is not going to help solve the problem. So we can either look for a solution or we can look at the problem. So the choice, I think, should really be how do we solve the problem.
All right, Meenakshi, I'll give you the last word, and then Zarni, just 10 seconds though. Go ahead, quick intervention.
There are solutions. In a genocide is not an exaggeration. And it has been very well documented. Whether you interpret the Genocide Convention in the most legally narrow technical sense of the convention to the letter, or you go with the original conception of genocide framed by Raphael Lemkin. This is genocide. I told you, like, there are numerous studies, Yale Law School, my own studies, others, and German and Jewish communities, they call it genocide. And secondly, there are tools. International law. The international law is not about shoplifting. Genocide Convention is an interstate treaty. Yeah? If China and Russia block any motions or binding resolution at the Security Council, there are other recourses. 140 plus UN member states signed and ratified the Genocide Convention, including my own country in 1956. Yeah? When you have a member state that is in blatant and clear violation of this interstate treaty, you allow this to happen. The states themselves undermine the peaceful world order. Finally, I am Buddhist. I'm taking my professional hat off. I am ashamed to call myself human today. We are facing the extinction threat. Just 2 weeks ago in London, 500 people trying to get in the swimming pool at the 35-degree temperature started fighting because they wanted the coolness of the water. Yeah? In Paris, temperature 42 degrees. In Paris, 2 weeks ago, I was there the next day. We are facing, as a family of humans, irrespective of our skin colors or faith or race or whatever, age, we are facing this common extinction threat. And we are behaving as if we live in the time of Westphalia. What Burma does is internal affair. And India is not on a higher moral plane. India and China are horn-locked in the Bay of Bengal, and Burma is a strategic place. We ignore the slogan, never again. I don't wear Buddha symbol. I am Buddhist, 56-year-old. I wear never again. Dark House, the staff at Dark House who sold this for €3 said, why are you buying this? This is useless. Never again. The world never learned from the Germans. That's from the German. I am ashamed to be human. Not even
Maya, I think it will be a good idea not to involve Myanmar activists in the return process. I would rather have Meenakshi doing the negotiation.
Right, I was just going to say, we'll let Meenakshi close
I thought
this
we were
panel.
going to wrap up. What do we say after never again?
Yeah,
We
that's-
kind of stop. Let's stop. We'll discuss it outside. But there's nothing. I don't think we can add to never again.
Never again, all
we
right.
take lesson learned, never again, and move on.
Okay, all right. Thank you. That's
Thank
been
you
an
so much.
extremely sort of interactive and emotive session. Thank you all for being such a patient audience.